Birdie Doyle stood up in the middle of the crowded town hall of Larkspur Crossing and held her father's deed above her head like a preacher holding scripture, and she said, loud enough for the back rows to hear over the stove's crackle, "Silas Merrick, you signed my father's name to a paper 3 weeks after we buried him, and I mean to prove it in front of every soul in this room." The hall went quiet the way a room goes quiet when a gun is cocked. Silas Merrick stood at the front behind a table covered with survey maps of Copper Creek and the proposed route of the Sheridan and Northern Rail Company, his silver watch chain catching the lamp light, his face arranging itself into patient sorrow, the face of a man who has practiced looking wronged. "Miss Doyle," he said, "grief does strange things to a person's memory. Your father sold that water right to the railway before he passed, God rest him, and I have the paper to prove it." "Then let everyone see the paper," Birdie said, and she walked down the center aisle in her good gray dress with the black piping she had sewn herself, and she set her father's homestead patent on the table beside Merrick's quitclaim, and she pointed at the date on his forged document with a finger that did not shake, though her heart was going like a rabbit's. "December the 9th, 1886. My father is buried in the churchyard with a stone dated November the 20th. Someone in this room signed a dead man's name 3 weeks after the ground froze over him." A murmur went through the crowd like wind through wheat. In the third row, a man in a dark coat who had not said a word all evening sat forward with his forearms on his knees, studying the 2 papers from a distance he had no right to see clearly. And yet he did not need to see them clearly, because he recognized the seal pressed into the corner of Merrick's paper, the little chip in the notary stamp that made the eagle's wing look broken. He had seen that broken wing before, 6 months earlier, on a survey document he had refused to carry to the Fenwick homestead with an eviction order in his other hand, and it was the reason he no longer wore a badge. His name was Edwin Dalton, and he had resigned as town marshal of Larkspur Crossing rather than put a family out of their cabin on the strength of a lie, and he had told himself since then that it was none of his business any more what Silas Merrick did with his notary stamps and his railroad maps, because a man without a badge has no authority to make it his business. But he sat there now with his jaw tight, looking at that broken eagle wing on the corner of the paper on the table, and he thought that some things become a man's business whether he asks for the job or not. "That is a clerical error," Merrick said smoothly, though a thin sheen had come up on his forehead. "Otis Crane notarized dozens of documents that season. A date misdrawn is not fraud, Miss Doyle. It is a man's tired hand at the end of a long year. A tired hand doesn't sign a name my father never learned to spell that way," Birdie said. "He wrote his D backward his whole life. Every deed, every letter, every mark he ever made. That signature on your paper has a D turned the right way round, Mr. Merrick, because whoever forged it didn't grow up watching him write his own name at the kitchen table." The room erupted into talk, ranchers leaning toward each other, a woman in the back saying my land is on that survey too, and Sheriff Dutch Halloran, who wore his badge like a man wears a borrowed coat, too big and uneasy in the shoulders, stood up from where he'd been leaning against the wall and said, "That is enough out of you, Miss Doyle. You come make an accusation like that against Mr. Merrick, you had better be ready to answer for it." "I am ready to answer for it," Birdie said. "I have been ready to answer for it since the day I found this quitclaim filed at the recorder's office, with a date my father could not have signed because he was already 3 weeks in his grave." Edwin Dalton stood then, without quite deciding to, the way a man stands when something in him has already made up its mind before his thinking catches up to it. "Sheriff," he said, "before you haul the lady off, you might ask Otis Crane to explain why the seal on that quitclaim has the same broken die I flagged for the county last autumn on the Fenwick survey. I filed a report on it. It ought to still be in the marshal's office, unless somebody misplaced it." Halloran's eyes cut toward Merrick, quick as a snake's tongue, before he answered. "Nobody asked you, Dalton. You're not the law here anymore, in case you forgot." "I remember it fine," Edwin said. I remember exactly why I quit being the law here, too. Merrick recovered his composure the way a cat recovers its dignity after a fall, smoothing his coat front, and he smiled at Birdie with all the warmth of a man who has already decided how the evening will end regardless of what happens in the middle of it. Miss Doyle is understandably distraught, he said to the room. Her business has struggled since her father's passing, and grief can lead a person to see conspiracies where there are only sad accidents. I bear her no ill will, but I will not stand in my own town hall and be called a forger without recourse. Sheriff, I believe slander against a man's good name is still a crime in this territory. It is, Halloran said, and he came down the aisle, and Birdie's chin lifted even as her hands closed hard on the two papers as though she could keep the truth from being taken out of the room along with her. Edwin moved without thinking about whether it was his place to move, stepping half into the aisle. You arrest her, Dutch. You had better arrest me too, because I'll swear in any court in this territory that the seal on that document is the same broken die from a fraud I reported before I ever turned in my badge. Edwin Dalton, said a voice from the doorway, sharp with a particular kind of exasperation only a bride can summon on the day before her wedding. You are not getting yourself thrown in the jailhouse the night before I marry you. It was Constance Whitfield, come looking for him with her shawl thrown hastily over her shoulders, and the whole room turned to look at her and then back at Edwin, and Birdie Doyle, still holding her father's papers, looked at him too, this stranger who had stood up for her in a room full of people who would not, and who was apparently getting married tomorrow to someone else entirely. Nothing was settled that night. Halloran, uncertain of his footing with half the room murmuring about their own contested surveys, decided against arresting Birdie in front of so many witnesses, but he told her plainly that Merrick would be filing a complaint, and that she would do well to consider her position before she made any more speeches. Merrick himself said nothing further, only gathered his maps with unhurried hands, and left through the side door with Otis Crane trailing after him like a dog that senses its master's temper. Birdie walked home to the little frame building on 3rd Street that housed her shop below and her rooms above. Her nephew Sam already asleep at Nell Sutter's boarding house, where he stayed on meeting nights, and she sat at her cutting table a long while with her father's patent spread in front of her under the lamp, running her thumb over his backward D. And she did not cry, because crying had never put bread on a table nor kept a roof from leaking, but she allowed herself to feel for a moment. Entirely and completely alone. 3 days later, Silas Merrick's promised complaint arrived in the form of Sheriff Halloran and a paper accusing Birdie Doyle of fraud and defamation, and with it came a second paper, brought not by the sheriff but by Wendell Cross himself, Merrick's nephew, a soft-spoken young man who worked at his uncle's bank and who arrived at Birdie's shop with his hat in his hands and would not quite meet her eyes. "My uncle asked me to bring you this," he said, holding out an envelope as though it might bite him. "He wanted me to say there need not be any unpleasantness. The charges could be set aside. Your father's note at the bank could be forgiven, the one that's kept you up nights, I expect, since the winter killed so much stock and half the county fell behind. And Sam's situation, being an orphan in your care with no husband to speak for the household, could be made secure, legally secure, so no one could ever question your fitness to raise him." Birdie's hands had gone still over her sewing. "And in exchange," Wendell's ears reddened, "in exchange you would marry me, Miss Doyle. It is a business arrangement, is all. I would never trouble you as a husband troubles a wife, if you understand what I mean. But once we were married, I would be able to sign for the household, as is proper, and settle the matter of the creek frontage with the railway, the way my uncle needs settled, and everyone's troubles would be over." She looked at him a long moment, at his soft hands and his uncertain eyes, and she understood the shape of the trap even before she fully understood its mechanism. The way a woman who has sewn 1,000 garments can tell a seam is wrong before she can say precisely why. "Your uncle needs someone's name on a paper releasing the water right," she said slowly. "I have refused him. My father would not sell, and I will not either. But if I married you, you could sign it as head of the household, and it would not matter what I wanted anymore." Wendell did not deny it, which was its own kind of answer, and that told her everything. "I have 3 days to decide, I suppose," she said, and he nodded and left, and Birdie sat a long while with Sam's small shoes drying by the stove, thinking of the fever that had taken his mother and the accident on the frozen river that had taken his father, her own brother, 2 winters past, and thinking that a woman alone with an orphaned boy and a mortgage and a fraud charge hanging over her had very few doors left open to her, and that every one of the doors that remained seemed to have Silas Merrick's hand on the latch. Edwin Dalton spent those same 3 days on his family's small spread 6 miles outside town, mending fence and trying not to think too hard about the woman with the backward D on her father's signature, and failing rather badly at both tasks. He was to marry Constance Whitfield that Sunday, a match his father and hers had discussed over cattle prices for 2 years before either Edwin or Constance had been consulted on the matter. A sensible union meant to join the Daltons' water frontage to the Whitfields' grazing land, and end a decade of prickly disputes between the families. Constance was kind and clever, and Edwin liked her well enough, the way a man likes a good horse or a well-made saddle, with respect and a certain fondness. But he had never once lain awake thinking of her the way he had lain awake 3 nights running now thinking of a seamstress with steady hands and a backward D on the Friday before the wedding. Percy Lund rode out to the Dalton place, dust to his hat brim, and found Edwin at the fence line. Percy clerked for the county recorder in Buffalo and had been Edwin's friend since they were boys fishing the same creek, and he had a way of arriving with bad news that made a man's stomach drop before he opened his mouth. "I went digging in the old filings after that business at the town hall," Percy said, swinging down from his horse. "You were right about the seal. I found 4 other quitclaims filed this past year with that same broken eagle wing, every one of them transferring water rights along Copper Creek to the railway's easement, every one of them signed by somebody who was either dead or, in one case, a woman who cannot write her own name, and yet signed hers in a fine copperplate hand. Merrick has been buying up the whole valley's water on the backs of forgeries, Edwin, and the survey filing deadline for the rail company's easement claims is Monday. Once that filing goes in at the land office, it becomes near impossible to unwind. Homesteaders all along the creek lose their water and lose their land right along with it once they can't irrigate. And Birdie Doyle's parcel," Edwin said, though he already knew the shape of the answer before Percy gave it, "sits square in the middle of the easement they need. She's the only holdout with clear title and no debt Merrick can call due to force her hand. Or she was the only holdout. Until I heard this morning she's set to marry Wendell Cross on Sunday afternoon out at the Merrick Ranch." Edwin stood with his hand on the fence rail a long moment, the wood rough and cool under his palm, spring runoff loud in the creek below where the snowpack up in the Bighorns was letting go early and hard after the terrible winter that had killed half the cattle in the county. "Sunday," he said. 2 o'clock, I hear. Same day as your own wedding, Edwin, which I don't suppose I need to remind you of." "No," Edwin said. "You don't need to remind me." Percy studied his friend's face with the particular patience of a man who has known someone since they were both missing their front teeth. "There's one more thing," he said. "Wendell Cross came into the recorder's office yesterday, alone, no uncle trailing him for once, and he asked me a strange question. He asked whether a marriage contract could bind a wife's separate property even if the wife never signed anything herself. I told him generally, once he was her husband he'd have standing to manage the household's affairs regardless of what she wished, unless she'd taken some legal precaution beforehand, which most women in this territory never think to do because most men never explain to them that they need to. He thanked me and left looking like a man who'd swallowed a stone. You think he's having second thoughts?" "I think," Percy said, "that boy is being made to do something he knows is rotten, and he doesn't have the backbone to refuse his uncle on his own account, but he might have just enough left to want somebody else to stop it for him. Edwin rode into Larkspur Crossing that afternoon and found Wendell Cross exactly where a man with a guilty conscience and no courage of his own could be found on a Friday, sitting on the porch steps of the bank after closing, turning his hat in his hands. Edwin did not waste time with pleasantries. "You're marrying Miss Doyle to get her water rights signed away," he said. "I know it. Percy Lund knows it. Question is whether you know it, or whether your uncle's told you some prettier story to help you sleep at night." Wendell's face went through several unhappy expressions before settling on something like relief, the relief of a man finally allowed to set down a heavy load. "He says it's business," Wendell said. "He says everybody in this valley will be better off once the railway comes through, that the whole territory will grow, that Miss Doyle will be provided for handsomely, and her nephew will want for nothing. But he made me sign a paper too, Mr. Dalton, a paper nobody showed her, promising that within a week of the wedding I'll deed the creek frontage over regardless of anything she says to me about it after we're married. He didn't even pretend to me it was her choice. He just told me it was mine to make on her behalf, once I was her husband, and that was that. Where's that paper now?" "In my coat," Wendell said, and then, after a long silence broken only by the creek running high and fast 3 streets over, he reached into his breast pocket and drew it out and held it toward Edwin with a trembling hand. "I don't want to marry a woman who doesn't want me, Mr. Dalton. I never did. But I'm afraid of my uncle, and I don't know how to stop being afraid of him, and I thought maybe if I gave this to somebody who wasn't afraid of him, something might come of it." Edwin took the paper and read it once, the language plain and damning, Wendell Cross agreeing to execute a quitclaim on the Doyle Creek frontage in favor of the Sheridan and Northern Rail Company within 7 days of his marriage, regardless of his wife's wishes in the matter, in exchange for the forgiveness of certain debts and the sum of $400 payable upon completion. It was signed at the bottom by both Wendell and Silas Merrick, witnessed by Otis Crane. "This is proof of the whole scheme," Edwin said. "Not just a forged signature on a dead man's paper, but a living plan to force a woman's hand through marriage and take what's hers without her consent, planned and paid for in advance. Will it help her?" "It'll help her a great deal," Edwin said, "provided it gets in front of the right eyes before Monday, and provided Miss Doyle isn't already your wife by the time anybody looks at it." Sunday morning came up bright and hard over the valley, the kind of high mountain light that made the snow on the peaks look close enough to touch, though it was miles off and dangerous, loosening under the sun and thundering down the far slopes in slides that the old-timers said had not been so frequent in 20 years, not since the winter had piled the drifts so deep. Edwin Dalton stood in his good black coat in the Larkspur Crossing church with Constance Whitfield beside him in white, her father beaming, his own father dabbing at his eyes, and the whole town crowded into the pews smelling of hair oil and lilac water, and Reverend Prine had gotten as far as speaking of the solemn covenant of marriage when Percy Lund came through the church door at a dead run, hat gone, breath tearing out of him. "Edwin," he said, not even trying to whisper it, "the wedding at the Merrick Ranch got moved up. They're marrying them at noon instead of 2, on account of Merrick wanting to file the easement papers in Buffalo himself first thing tomorrow, and he don't want any more chances for talk to spread before it's done. It's happening right now, Edwin. It might already be done." The church went silent in the particular way a church goes silent when something has gone terribly wrong in the middle of something meant to be right. Constance turned to look at Edwin, and whatever she saw in his face, she did not look surprised by it, only sad, and a little relieved, in a way Edwin would not understand until later that day. "Go," she said quietly just to him, under the murmur rising around them. "Edwin, look at your own face. You've been looking at that woman's papers in your mind since Thursday night, not at me. Go on and go before I have to be the one to say it in front of God and everybody." "Constance, go," she said again, and there was nothing hard in it, only a plain kindness that he would remember with gratitude for the rest of his life. "I'll explain it to my father. I expect he'll survive the shock." Go." Edwin Dalton walked back down the aisle of his own wedding in his black coat with his boots loud on the wood floor, past his father's stricken face and Constance's mother already reaching for a handkerchief, past the whole town of Larkspur Crossing turning to watch him go. And he did not stop walking until he was through the church doors and onto his horse. And then he rode, past the hitching rail where the wedding guests' buggy stood waiting, past the little cluster of children who had come out to watch him go with their mouths open, past his own wedding entirely, out the north road toward the Merrick Ranch 6 miles distant, with Wendell Cross's signed confession folded inside his coat, and his heart going harder than his horse's hooves against the road. At the Merrick Ranch house, in the front parlor cleared of furniture and strung with ribbon for the occasion, Birdie Doyle stood in a borrowed dress of pale blue that Nell Sutter had lent her because Birdie had not owned, nor wished to own, anything that looked like a wedding dress, and she listened to the circuit preacher speaking words. She had agreed to only because the alternative was a jail cell and a boy with no one left to raise him, and she kept her eyes on a point on the far wall above Wendell Cross's shoulder, because she could not bear to look at his face and see how little either of them wanted this. "Do you, Birdie Doyle, take this man?" The front door burst open with enough force to rattle the ribbon strung across the archway, and Edwin Dalton came through it still in his black wedding coat, hatless, breathing hard, and he said, "Stop this wedding," in a voice that filled the whole room and left no space in it for anyone to pretend they had not heard him. Silas Merrick rose from his seat near the front, his face going through surprise into fury so fast it might have given a lesser man whiplash. "Dalton, what in God's name? You have your own bride waiting on you in town, or have you forgotten?" "I left her at the altar," Edwin said, "and she told me to go, and I'm not sorry for it, because this wedding is being conducted on a lie, and I have the proof of it in my coat." Birdie turned to look at him then, this man in his black wedding coat who had apparently ridden 6 miles from his own ceremony to interrupt hers, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight as a fist for 3 days loosened just slightly, though she could not yet have said why. "You will explain yourself, sir, or you will be removed," Merrick said, and 2 hands from the ranch had already stepped forward from the edges of the room, but Edwin did not so much as glance at them. Wendell Cross signed an agreement with his uncle promising to deed Miss Doyle's creek frontage to the Sheridan and Northern Rail Company within 7 days of this marriage, whatever she herself might want about it, and he was paid $400 to do it, Edwin said, drawing the folded paper from his coat and holding it up. "This wedding is not a rescue from Miss Doyle's troubles, Mr. Merrick. It is the very last step of the theft you have been committing against her since before her father was even buried, and against every homesteader along that creek, whose water right your man Otis Crane forged away with a broken notary seal. I have 4 other forged quitclaims on file at the county recorder's office that match it, and I mean to see all of it in front of the land commissioner in Buffalo before you can file your easement claim tomorrow." The room had gone very still. Wendell Cross, standing beside Birdie in his good suit, had turned the color of old ash, and he did not deny a single word. "Is that true?" Birdie said to him quietly, and there was something in her voice worse than anger, a kind of exhausted disappointment that landed on Wendell harder than any shout could have. "I gave him the paper," Wendell said, meaning Edwin, not looking at his uncle at all now. "I gave it to him myself, Miss Doyle. I couldn't do it to you. I'm sorry it took me this long to say so out loud." Silas Merrick's composure finally cracked all the way through, and what showed underneath it was not sorrow at all. "You sniveling fool," he snapped at his nephew, and then, rounding on Edwin, "You have no authority here, Dalton. You are not the marshal. You are not even a witness with clean hands, since you resigned rather than do your duty when I asked it of you." "I resigned because your duty and the law's duty had stopped being the same thing," Edwin said. "And I don't need a badge to stand in a room and tell the truth, Mr. Merrick. Miss Doyle, this marriage is being entered into under false pretenses. You have been told it would save your home and your nephew, and your good name. It would have done none of those things. It would only have handed your father's land to this man's railroad scheme with your own signature nowhere on the paper that took it, because it wouldn't have needed to be. Birdie looked at the preacher, who had gone very quiet, and at Wendell, who would not lift his eyes from the floor, and at Sheriff Halloran, who had come along as a witness and now stood near the door looking as though he badly wished he had found somewhere else to be, and finally at Edwin Dalton, still breathing hard from his ride, still wearing another woman's wedding on his face and shoulders, and she made her decision the way she made every important decision in her life. Quickly and with her whole self behind it. "I will not be marrying Mr. Cross today," she said, loud enough to reach every corner of the parlor. "Reverend Prine, I thank you for your trouble, but there will be no wedding here this afternoon." "You will regret this," Merrick said, low and cold. "The fraud complaint against you still stands, Miss Doyle, and without this marriage to settle it, I promise you the sheriff will see it through to a courtroom where I have considerably more friends than you do." "Then I suppose we had better get to Buffalo before your easement filing does," Birdie said, and she looked at Edwin, and something passed between them that was not quite trust yet, not on such short acquaintance, but was at least the shape trust might someday grow into. They did not linger at the Merrick ranch. Halloran made a show of blustering about arresting somebody, anybody, but with Wendell's signed confession in Edwin's coat and half a dozen ranch hands who had heard every word standing around looking distinctly unwilling to lay hands on either Edwin Dalton or Birdie Doyle on Silas Merrick's behalf, he settled for threats and let them go, though his eyes promised the matter was far from finished. They rode first to town, where Birdie changed out of Nell's borrowed blue dress into her own traveling clothes and gathered what few things she would need, and where Sam Doyle, 8 years old and fierce as a barn cat, threw his arms around her waist so hard he nearly knocked her over. "I heard you're not marrying that Cross fellow after all," he said, muffled against her skirt. "I am not," Birdie said, smoothing his hair. "I have to go to Buffalo instead, Sam, to see a land commissioner about our creek, and I need you to stay here with Nell and mind her chickens and not give her one lick of trouble. Is that man going to keep you safe?" Sam asked, eyeing Edwin, who stood in the boarding house doorway still looking rumpled and travel-worn and entirely out of place in the remnants of his wedding coat. "I mean to try, young man," Edwin said before Birdie could answer for him, and something about the plain seriousness of it seemed to satisfy Sam, who nodded once, the way men nod to seal an agreement, and let go of his aunt. Nell Sutter, a broad, capable woman who had buried one husband and outlasted 2 blizzards on her own before taking up the boarding house, walked Birdie to the door and pressed a bundle of bread and dried venison into her hands. "You watch that road," she said. "The whole valley's talking about how the mountain's been letting go early this year, worse than anybody's seen. And you watch him too," she added, with a glance at Edwin that was not entirely unkind. "A man who will ride out of his own wedding for the truth is either the best sort there is or the most reckless fool in Wyoming territory, and I have not yet decided which." "Might be both," Birdie said, and swung up onto the borrowed horse Nell had arranged, and did not look back at the church where, 6 hours earlier, another woman had stood waiting for a groom who never came. The road to Buffalo ran along the base of the foothills before climbing toward a pass, and it was slow going from the start, the mud deep with runoff and the creek beside the road running high and brown and loud with snowmelt. They rode a while in a silence that had more suspicion in it than comfort. "I don't suppose you make a habit of interrupting weddings," Birdie said finally, mostly to break the quiet, though there was an edge of real curiosity under it. "First one," Edwin said. "Can't say I recommend it as a regular practice. Hard on the coat." She glanced sideways at him, at the black wedding coat now dusted with mud and creek spray, and something that was almost a laugh escaped her before she could stop it, surprising them both. "You left an actual bride at an actual altar." "I did." "And she just told you to go?" "She did." Told me I'd been looking at your papers in my mind since Thursday, not at her, and she wasn't wrong about it, though I hadn't much wanted to look at that truth myself. Birdie considered this with the frank, assessing look she might have given a bolt of cloth to judge its weave. That's a strange thing to say to a woman you rode past your own wedding for. It's a strange sort of day, Edwin said. Seemed to call for strange sorts of honesty. They rode on, and Birdie found herself watching him from the corner of her eye more than she meant to, the set of his shoulders, the careful way he checked the road ahead where it narrowed against the hillside, the fact that he had not once, in all the chaos of the morning, tried to tell her what to do or how to feel about any of it, only laid the facts in front of her and let her make her own choice, which was rarer in a man than she had learned to expect. "Why did you resign?" she asked after a while. "Being marshal, what happened with the Fenwick homestead?" Edwin's jaw tightened, though his voice stayed even. "Merrick came to me with a survey saying the Fenwick claim overlapped railroad land, wanted me to serve an eviction that same week, before the family could even get a lawyer up from Cheyenne to look at the paper. I rode out to their place myself first, before I'd serve anything, and I looked at their original patent, and it didn't overlap anything at all. The survey Merrick handed me had been redrawn to move their fence line 40 yards onto their own porch. I went back and told him I wouldn't serve it, and he told me a marshal who wouldn't follow the town council's instruction wasn't much use to the town council, and I told him he was welcome to that opinion, and I left my badge on his desk. Where are the Fenwicks now? Moved on to Nebraska last fall. Lost the argument in the end, since nobody with any pull would take up their case once I was gone, and the man they got as marshal after me does what he's told." He looked over at her. "That's why I recognized the seal on your father's paper before you'd even finished pointing at the date. I'd seen Otis Crane's broken die before, and I'd already lost one fight to it. I didn't much care to lose a second." Birdie absorbed this, turning it over. "So this isn't only chivalry riding out here after me." "No," Edwin agreed. "It isn't only that." "Good," she said. "I'd have hated to think I was somebody's rescue project. I've had enough of men deciding what's good for me this week to last a lifetime." "Noted," Edwin said, and something in his tone, dry and a little amused, made her look at him again. And this time when their eyes met, neither of them looked away quite as quickly as good sense might have suggested. They made perhaps 12 miles before the light began going long and gold across the meadows, and it was then, rounding a bend where the road dropped toward the North Fork crossing, that they came upon the first real trouble of the journey. A stagecoach sat stopped in the road, its 4 horses stamping and unhappy, and beyond it, where the road ran down to the crossing, the bridge that spanned the North Fork hung broken in the middle. One whole span of it collapsed into the rushing brown water, timbers scattered downstream, the far bank simply out of reach. The stage driver, a leathery man named Hutch, stood with his hands on his hips studying the wreckage while 3 passengers, a young family with a baby, argued with him about how long they might be stranded. "Ice took the footing out from under her sometime last night, near as I can tell," Hutch said when Edwin and Birdie rode up. "Whole mountains shedding snow faster than it has in years, and this crossing wasn't built to take that much water at once. I've got a family here needs to get to Buffalo before the baby comes down sicker, and no way over." Birdie swung down from her horse and walked to the edge of the broken span, studying the wreckage with the same careful, assessing eye she might have given a torn seam. "The near half of the bridge is still standing," she said. "It's the middle span that dropped. If we could get a line across to the far bank and rig some kind of support underneath, even something temporary, we might be able to walk people and light cargo across, if not the stage itself." "With what?" Hutch said. "I've got rope in the boot, maybe 40 feet, no lumber to speak of. I have canvas and heavy thread in my kit, and there's cordage in that broken railing if we work it loose," Birdie said. "It won't hold a stagecoach, but it might hold a person walking careful, and it'll hold better than nothing." Edwin was already down off his horse and wading out along the standing half of the bridge, testing the timbers with his boot heel, and he looked back at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, something between respect and surprise. "You built this out of a torn seam and a scrap of rope in your head just now, didn't you?" "I build things out of scraps for a living, Mr. Dalton," Birdie said. "A dress is 40 pieces of cloth that have no business holding together until somebody makes them. A bridge isn't so different." They worked through the fading light with Hutch and the young father from the stage, Birdie directing the lashing of the broken railing timbers into a rough truss, while Edwin climbed out onto the standing span to anchor the rope, the creek roaring beneath them loud enough that they had to shout to be heard, spray coming up cold and fine in the last of the sun. Birdie's fingers, quick and sure from years at a needle, worked the waxed thread from her sewing kit into the rope splices where the fibers had frayed, doubling the strength of the knots in a way that made Hutch whistle low in appreciation. "Where'd a seamstress learn not work like that?" he asked. "Same place a seamstress learns everything useful," Birdie said. "Necessity. My father fished this creek every spring of my childhood, and a girl who wanted to come along learned to tie a line proper or got left on the bank." By the time the makeshift truss was lashed into place, full dark had come down and they worked the last of it by lantern light, Edwin holding the light steady while Birdie tied off the final splice with cold-numbed fingers, and when she straightened up and blew on her hands, he took them without quite asking permission and rubbed some warmth back into them with his own, an act so simple and practical that neither of them made anything of it in the moment, though Birdie would think of it later. Of how easy and unhurried his hands had been, no more forward than a man warming a friend's fingers deserved to be, and yet it had undone something in her chest all the same. "It'll hold a person," Edwin said, testing his own weight on the truss and finding it steady enough. "We'll get the family across tonight, and the rest of us can make camp on this side and cross at first light when we can see what we're doing." They ferried the young family across first, the mother clutching her feverish baby, the father white-knuckled on the rope, Edwin going first each time to steady the far end and Birdie staying near the near bank to talk each person through their footing, her voice calm and sure even as the creek roared and the makeshift bridge groaned under the strain. It took the better part of 2 hours to get the family, their 2 trunks and Hutch's strongbox across, and by the time it was done, everyone's hands were raw and everyone's nerves were thin. It was as they were finally settling the horses and building a fire on the near bank, deciding to wait for daylight themselves before crossing, that trouble found them. 4 riders came down the road out of the dark, and even before the firelight caught their faces, Edwin's hand had gone to the rifle in his saddle scabbard, because he recognized the lead horse as belonging to one of Merrick's ranch hands. "Evening," the lead rider called, reining up at the edge of the firelight. He was a broad man named Croy who worked cattle for Merrick and had a reputation for being handy with his fists when handiness was called for. "Mr. Merrick sent us after a certain paper he believes Mr. Dalton is carrying. Be a lot easier on everybody if you handed it over now." "That paper's evidence of a crime," Edwin said, standing slow and easy, keeping his hands visible but ready. "Your Mr. Merrick doesn't get to have it back just for asking." "Wasn't asking," Croy said, and 2 of the other riders swung down, and for a moment the firelight and the roar of the creek and the crackle of tension between them all seemed to hang suspended, the way the air hangs before a storm breaks. Birdie did not wait to see how the men decided to settle it. She had already slipped one hand into the deep pocket of her traveling skirt where, before they'd left Larkspur Crossing, she had unpicked the hem of her petticoat and stitched Wendell's confession flat inside the lining, a habit born of years of hiding pins and coins and other small necessities in her clothing where a person wouldn't think to look, and she stepped sideways into the shadow beyond the fire's light while the men's attention stayed fixed on Edwin. "You can search Mr. Dalton's coat all you like," she called out, loud enough to draw every eye, "but you won't find what you're looking for on him because I've had it the whole time." It was, strictly speaking, a lie in that moment, since the confession was in fact folded in Edwin's coat pocket exactly where he'd put it that morning. But it served its purpose, drawing Croy's attention, and two of his men toward her instead of toward Edwin. And in the scramble and confusion of that redirection, Edwin got his hand on his rifle and leveled it before anyone had drawn a weapon of their own. "Nobody needs to get hurt over a piece of paper," Edwin said, his voice carrying clean and hard over the creek noise. "But I will put a hole in the first man who lays a hand on Miss Doyle, and you can carry that message back to Merrick along with whatever else you tell him." Croy studied the rifle, and studied Edwin's face behind it, and seemed to do some quick arithmetic about how much his wages were worth against the certainty in Edwin Dalton's eyes, and after a long moment he held up both hands, palms out. "No call for shooting," he said. "We'll be heading back." "You'll leave the horses standing right where they are a minute more," Edwin said, "while Miss Doyle and I put some distance between us and your memory of exactly where we're headed." It was a bluff, since there was nowhere to go in the dark with a broken bridge behind them and a rickety rope crossing that no one wanted to attempt at night. But Croy and his men, uncertain how many more surprises the night held, mounted up and rode back the way they had come, muttering, and did not return. When the sound of their hooves had faded into the general roar of the creek, Birdie let out a breath she had been holding so long her ribs ached with it, and Edwin lowered the rifle slowly and looked at her with something between alarm and admiration. "You told them you had it," he said. "You don't have it. I have it." "I have a copy," Birdie said, and reached into her petticoat hem and drew out the folded, slightly creased duplicate she had made that morning while Edwin saddled the horses, copying Wendell's confession word for word in her own small, careful hand while he wasn't looking. Because a seamstress who has learned never to trust a single seam to hold a whole garment together does not trust a single copy of a document to survive a 40-mile ride through hostile country either. Edwin stared at the paper, and then at her, and then he laughed, a short, startled sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised her. "You copied a legal confession by firelight while I was checking the cinch straps. I had a spare hour while you argued with Hutch about lumber," Birdie said. "A person ought to always have a spare hour's worth of usefulness in her, Mr. Dalton. It's gotten me through worse nights than this one." They sat by the fire a while after that, the horses settled and the creek still roaring beyond them, and the strange intimacy of shared danger loosened something between them that had not quite loosened on the ride. Some careful distance both of them had been keeping without entirely meaning to. "You could have just told them the truth," Edwin said eventually, "that I had it. Instead you drew their eyes onto yourself." "You had the rifle," Birdie said simply, as though it required no further explanation. "I had a lie that might buy a few seconds, seemed the better trade at the time. That was a fool thing to risk all the same." "I've been called worse than a fool this week," Birdie said. "Merrick's man called me a hysterical woman not 3 days past, and my own intended husband briefly called me nothing at all, since he could hardly look at me the whole engagement. I'll take fool from a man who at least had the decency to notice I'd done something clever, thank you." Edwin was quiet a moment, watching the fire. "It wasn't foolish," he said finally. "It was quick thinking under a gun, is what it was, and I've known deputized men who couldn't manage that much." Something in his voice, plain and without flattery, landed differently on Birdie than Wendell's careful courtesies ever had, and she found herself studying his profile in the firelight, the strong line of his jaw, the tiredness around his eyes that spoke of a very long day that had started at his own wedding and ended defending hers from armed men on a mountain road. "Your bride," she said carefully, "Constance, do you think she'll be all right? I know it isn't my business, only I keep thinking of her standing there in her wedding dress." "I think," Edwin said slowly, "that Constance Whitfield has been in love with Tom Ashford, one of her father's hands, since she was about 16 years old, and has never once said so out loud to anybody because it wasn't a match either of our fathers would have approved, and that when she told me to go after you this morning, there was more relief in her voice than heartbreak. I mean to write her a proper letter once this business with Merrick is settled, and I expect I'll find I'm right about it. You knew that and you were going to marry her anyway. It was a sensible match, Edwin said, a little defensively. Our family's land runs along the same creek. It solved a decade of arguing about fence lines. I told myself sensible was enough to build a marriage on, since I hadn't found any better reason to marry anybody else. And now? He looked at her across the fire and did not answer right away, and the silence stretched out comfortable and charged all at once, the creek roaring beneath the stars, the horses shifting in their picket line, until finally he said, "Now I expect I've found a better reason, though it's a poor time to say so, with you not 12 hours out of a wedding of your own that you didn't want, and me not 12 hours out of one I walked away from." "It is a poor time," Birdie agreed. "Terrible timing, in fact. I'd say most inconvenient timing I've encountered in my entire life." "And yet," Edwin said. "And yet," Birdie agreed, and did not look away from him, and something passed between them in the firelight that was not quite a promise, not yet, but was the seed of one, planted in ground that had been plowed hard and fast by one very long day. They crossed the Mendied Bridge at first light, the truss holding steady under their weight, and Hutch's stage passengers, camped a night on the far bank, cheered them across, and by midday they had reached Buffalo, tired and mud-splattered and travel-worn, with the confession and the forged quitclaims and Birdie's father's patent all safely in hand. The land office sat on Buffalo's Main Street, a low brick building with the territorial seal painted above the door, and Commissioner Abel Wren, a spare, gray-whiskered man who had held his post since the office opened, listened to the whole account with the particular stillness of a man accustomed to sorting truth from complaint. "You understand," he said, when Edwin and Birdie had laid every document on his desk, "that Silas Merrick is a man of some standing in this territory. An accusation of this size will not be settled by my say alone." "We're not asking you to settle it alone," Edwin said. "We're asking you to hold the easement filing until a proper investigation can be made, and to send word to the territorial marshal's office in Cheyenne about the forged notary seals, since that's a matter for federal jurisdiction as much as local." Wren studied Wendell's signed confession a long while, and the quitclaims with their matching broken eagle die, and Michael Doyle's original patent with its consistent backward D across a dozen old filings, and finally he set the papers down and looked at Birdie directly. "You are Michael Doyle's daughter," he said. "I remember your father. He filed his water claim with this office himself, back in '79, and I recall he had the worst handwriting I'd seen that whole season, on account of that backward letter. I told him so at the time. He laughed about it. He never did learn to write it the other way," Birdie said, and something in her voice caught, just slightly, at the memory. "Said he'd been writing it wrong since he was 6 years old and saw no reason to fix a habit that had served him fine for 40 years. Wren nodded slowly. "I'll hold the Sheridan and Northern's easement filing pending investigation," he said, "and I'll send word to Cheyenne about Otis Crane's notary commission today. Whatever else comes of this, Miss Doyle, your father's water right stands as filed, under his name, and no fraudulent quitclaim signed after his death is going to move it out from under you while I hold this office." Birdie let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere very deep, and Edwin, standing beside her, reached over without quite thinking about it and pressed her hand once briefly, and she let him, and did not pull away. They stayed 2 days in Buffalo while the territorial marshal's deputy took statements and sent his own wire to Cheyenne, and word came back within the week that Otis Crane's notary commission had been revoked pending charges, and that a federal investigator would be riding out to look into the matter of the forged quitclaims along Copper Creek, which meant a good deal more trouble for Silas Merrick than a mere revoked filing. They rode back to Larkspur Crossing together, slower this time, no longer racing a deadline, and something had changed in the easy quiet between them, a comfort that had not been there on the outbound ride, built out of a mended bridge and a night by a fire and the particular closeness that comes from surviving a thing together. What happens to Wendell? Birdie asked, somewhere along the road, watching a hawk circle over the meadow. Federal investigator will want his testimony, Edwin said. He gave it freely already once to me. I expect he'll give it again, and I expect it'll go easier on him than it will on his uncle, since a man who confesses and helps stop a fraud is treated differently than a man who built one. He was a coward, Birdie said, but not a cruel one. There's a difference, I think, though it took me most of a bad week to see it. There is, Edwin agreed. I've known cruel men and cowardly ones both, and the cowardly ones can sometimes be talked into doing right, if somebody gives them the chance and doesn't ask more bravery of them than they've got in stock. When they reached Larkspur Crossing at last, the news of Merrick's forgeries had already spread through the valley faster than either of them could have carried it. Homesteaders along Copper Creek who had quietly sold their water rights under pressure, now gathering at the recorder's office to ask whether their own sales might be examined too. And Silas Merrick himself, when the federal investigator arrived a week later, found rather fewer friends willing to vouch for his character than he had expected. Sheriff Halloran among the first to distance himself, suddenly recalling a great many irregularities he had somehow failed to notice at the time. Birdie went first to Nell Sutter's boarding house, where Sam came flying off the porch steps to meet her, demanding a full account of the bridge and the men with rifles, and whether she had truly told a lie to a dangerous cattle hand, which Nell had apparently already heard some garbled version of from a passing rider and had been unable to keep entirely to herself. I did tell a lie, Birdie admitted, crouching to Sam's height, though it was a useful one and I'll not make a habit of it. Did it work? It bought us the time we needed, Birdie said, and Mr. Dalton did the rest with a rifle he didn't have to fire, which is the best kind of using a rifle there is. Sam looked past her to where Edwin stood holding both horses, and something in the boy's face settled, decided, the way children decide things about adults quickly and often correctly. You're the one that rode past his own wedding, he said, not quite a question. I am, Edwin admitted. Nell said that was the most foolish thing she'd heard of in 10 years and also the most romantic, and she couldn't decide which she wanted to say first. Sam Doyle, Nell said from the porch, scandalized. I said no such thing where you could hear it. You said it in the kitchen. I was getting a biscuit. Edwin, watching Birdie laugh for the first time since the whole ordeal had begun. 3 days of terror and mud and forged papers, and a broken bridge finally cracking open into something lighter, thought that he had never in his life seen anything he wanted more to keep seeing than that particular laugh. And he found himself, not for the first time that week, entirely undone by a woman who had never once asked him to rescue her, only to stand beside her while she rescued herself. Constance Whitfield sought Edwin out 2 days later, finding him at the fence line where he had first heard the whole business from Percy, and she came without her father this time, dressed plainly, her expression open in a way it had never quite been in the careful, arranged years of their engagement. I owe you an apology, I think, Edwin said before she could speak. For the manner of it, if not the fact of it. A man oughtn't leave a woman standing at an altar, whatever the reason. You're not going to get an argument from me about the manner of it, Constance said, with a wry twist to her mouth. It was a scandal, Edwin, and my mother has not stopped talking about it, and half the town seems to think I ought to be devastated, which has been rather inconvenient, since I am not devastated in the slightest. Percy tells me Tom Ashford came calling on your father the very next day. Constance's composure slipped, just slightly, into something warmer. He did. Turns out a broken engagement clears a great deal of confusion out of a man's head about what he ought to say and to whom. I've been wanting to thank you properly, Edwin, though it feels a strange thing to thank a man for jilting me. You're welcome, Edwin said, though I confess I didn't do it for your benefit. Constance agreed. You did it because you'd already fallen for Birdie Doyle before you ever stood up in that church, and you were too honest a man to go through with marrying me while carrying that in your chest. I dare say it's the finest quality you've got, Edwin Dalton, and it very nearly cost you a wife who deserved better than a man's divided heart. I hope you know what you've got in her. She's twice the woman this valley gives her credit for." "I'm coming to know it," Edwin said, "a little more every day." Silas Merrick's trial, when it finally came before a territorial judge in Cheyenne that summer, was a briefer affair than the scale of his wrongdoing might have suggested, since Wendell Cross's testimony, corroborated by the recorder's filings and the federal investigators' own findings against Otis Crane, left very little room for Merrick's lawyers to maneuver. He was convicted of fraud and forgery and sentenced to a term in the territorial prison, and the bank he had run was placed under new management, and the Sheridan and Northern Rail Company, once it understood the scandal attached to its proposed route, quietly withdrew its survey and began looking at a crossing point further south that troubled no one's water rights at all. Wendell Cross, spared the worst of the prosecution on account of his cooperation, left the valley entirely, taking a clerking position in Cheyenne where nobody knew his family's name, and Birdie, when she heard of it, felt something that was not quite forgiveness, but was at least the absence of any wish to see him suffer further. It was late summer by the time Edwin Dalton finally worked up the nerve to say properly what had been sitting unspoken between them since the night of the fire, and he chose, with a deliberateness that made Birdie laugh when he confessed it to her afterward, the very bridge they had mended together. Now, rebuilt properly with fresh timber, the county had finally gotten around to hauling in. The creek beneath it running clear and low now that the spring floods had passed, and summer had settled warm and gold over the valley. "I have been turning something over in my mind since the night we camped here," he said, standing beside her on the new planking while the creek murmured gently below, nothing like the roaring thing it had been that terrible night. "I did not marry Constance Whitfield, and I have thought a good deal since about why that turned out to be the rightest wrong thing I ever did, and I have come to understand it is because some part of me already knew, before I could have said it plain, that the woman I wanted beside me for the whole of my life was the one standing in a town hall with her father's deed held over her head, not backing down from a man twice her standing in the county." "That is a very roundabout way of saying something, Edwin Dalton," Birdie said, though her voice had gone soft. "I'm getting to the plain part," he said. "Birdie Doyle, I have watched you rebuild a bridge with sewing thread and outwit armed men with a lie you made up on the spot, and stand in front of a land commissioner with your chin up though your whole world was hanging on his answer, and I have never in my life admired anybody the way I admire you, and I do not think I could go back to a quiet, sensible life now even if I wanted to, because you have ruined me for sensible. I love you. I would like very much to marry you, properly this time, with no other bride waiting anywhere else on the same day, if you'll have a man who once rode straight past his own wedding to reach you." Birdie looked at him a long moment, the creek light dancing on the water below them, and she thought of her father's backward D and the shop she had nearly lost, and the boy asleep at Nell's boarding house who had already, without being asked, started calling Edwin by his first name as though he'd known him all his life, and she thought that she had spent the whole terrible spring being handed men's plans for her future, Merrick's scheme and Wendell's reluctant compliance, and that this, finally, was a man asking rather than deciding, and she found she did not need to think about her answer at all. "I will have you," she said, "provided you understand I intend to keep the shop and keep raising Sam my own way, and keep an opinion about every fence and water right that crosses my land for the rest of my natural life." "I would have you no other way," Edwin said, and when he kissed her there on the new planking of the bridge they had mended together, the whole valley seemed to hold its breath around them, the creek running easy and clear beneath, the mountains behind them finally free of their heavy winter snow, spring's danger passed into summer's quiet plenty. They married in October, when the aspens along Copper Creek had gone gold and the harvest was in a small ceremony at the Larkspur Crossing Church that Birdie insisted on holding in the daylight so half the valley could see her walk in on her own 2 feet, rather than be given away by anyone, since she had spent quite enough of the year being handed from one man's plan to another. Nell Sutter stood as her witness, weeping unashamedly through the whole thing, and Percy Lund stood as Edwin's, grinning like a man who had known all along how the story would end. Constance Whitfield came with Tom Ashford on her arm, newly engaged themselves, and sat in the 3rd pew and cried a little too, though for entirely happy reasons this time. Sam Doyle, given the solemn duty of carrying the ring on a small velvet cushion he had insisted on choosing himself at Birdie's shop, marched down the aisle with the gravity of a boy who understood he was participating in something important. And when Reverend Prine finally pronounced Edwin and Birdie husband and wife, Sam cheered loud enough that half the church laughed along with him. Edwin sold his family's spread that winter and moved into the rooms above Birdie's shop, and between his knowledge of land and water, Law learned hard in his years wearing a badge, and Birdie's steady hand with a needle and an even steadier one with a ledger, they built something neither could have built alone. Birdie's shop grew into the finest dressmaking establishment between Buffalo and Sheridan, and Edwin, elected town marshal that spring by a town eager to have an honest man back in the office, made certain no broken eagle seal ever stamped a false document in Larkspur Crossing again. Sam grew up calling him Pa without either of them ever quite deciding when the word had changed, only that it fit, the way a well-made seam fits, invisible and strong and holding everything together exactly where it needed to hold. Years later, when Sam was grown and had children of his own asking to hear the story again, Birdie would tell it the same way every time, sitting by the stove with her hands never quite still, always mending something even in the telling. She would tell them about the town hall and the backward D, about the broken bridge and the firelight confession copied onto a scrap of petticoat, about a man in a black wedding coat who came through a door with mud on his boots and the truth in his hands, and about how sometimes the rightest thing a person could do looked, from the outside, exactly like the wrong thing, if you didn't know yet what was waiting on the other side of it. Your grandfather rode straight past his own wedding, she would say, and Edwin, listening from his chair by the window, would smile the same small, satisfied smile he always did at that part of the story. And it was, without a single doubt in my mind, the finest thing anybody ever did for me in my whole life. "Weren't you angry at him?" one of the grandchildren asked once, "for jilting that other lady?" "I was too busy being grateful," Birdie said. "And besides, that other lady married a man she'd loved since she was 16 and never once looked back. So I'd say everybody involved came out the better for it in the end, the way things sometimes do when the truth finally gets where it's going, even if it has to ride hard and arrive covered in mud to get there." Outside, the mountains stood quiet under an ordinary spring snowfall, gentle this year, nothing like the terrible winter that had started it all, and the creek ran clear past the Mendied Bridge, and the valley, divided once by fences and forged papers and old men's greed, had settled at last into the kind of peace that comes only after the truth has been fought for and won, and kept.